Hello, folks. This is Jason. This is the top 22 stories on Project Censored, the website. I'll leave the link below. These are their most underreported, most censored stories, not very underreported or not reported at all in the mainstream news. Number one, and this is going to be 1 through 10. I think I'm going to do 1 through 10. U.S. military forces deployment in 70% of world's nations. If you throw a dart at the world map and do not hit water, Nick Turse reported for Tom Dispatch, the odds that the United States Special Operation Forces have been there sometime in 2015. According to a spokesman for Special Operations Command, SOCOM, in 2015, Special Operations Forces, SOF, deployed in 147 of the world's 195 recognized nations, 147 countries, an increase of 8% since 2010. The global growth of SOF missions has been breathtaking, Turse wrote. I'll leave the link below, but basically, we're in 147 countries out of 195. Huge military presence. Again, I'll leave the link below. You can check it out. Number 2 on the Project Censored list of the most unreported stories. Crisis in evidence-based medicine. Now, this one I found most fascinating, actually. In April 2015, the Lancet's editor, if you know the Lancet's a pretty good little newspaper, little magazine, Richard Horton wrote, "Something has gone fundamentally wrong with one of our greatest human creations," describing the upshot of a UK symposium held that month of the reproducibility and reliability of biomedical research. Horton summarized the case against science. Much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue. Afflicted by studies with small sample sizes, tiny effects, invalid exploratory analysis, and flagrant conflicts of interest, together with an obsession for pursuing fashionable trends of dubious importance, science has taken a turn towards darkness. The apparent endemicity of bad research behavior is alarming. Horton is not the first editor of a prominent medical journal to raise these concerns. In 2009, Marcy Engel, a former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, made a comparable claim in an article for the New York Review of Books. It is simply no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research that is published, or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians of authoritative medical guidelines. I have no pleasure in this conclusion, which I reached slowly and reluctantly over my 2 decades as editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. Jesus Christ. Countering the pharmaceutical industry's undue influence on the medical profession, Angel concluded, would require a sharp break from an extremely lucrative pattern of behavior. Horton's Lancet editor echoed Engel's assessments. Can bad scientific practices be fixed? Part of the problem is that no one is incentivized to be right. Instead, scientists are incentivized to be productive and innovative. Jesus Christ. No biomedical studies better epitomize this corruption and confliction of interest noted by insider critics like Engel and Horton than Study 329, a now notorious clinical trial published in the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry in 2001. Study 329 reported that paroxetine, marketed by Beecham, now GlaxoSmithKline, or GSK, as Paxil in the United States, and as Serowaxed in the UK, was safe and effective for treating depressed children and adolescents. A GSK marketing campaign built on the published study touting the drug's remarkably, quote-unquote, remarkable efficacy and safety led to doctors prescribing Paxil to more than 2 million U.S. children and adolescents by the end of 2002. However, within a year of the original report, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration declared Study 329 a failed trial because further evidence indicated that adolescents prescribed the drug to treat depression fared no better than those on a placebo. In 2003, the UK drug regulators instructed doctors not to prescribe Serexat to adolescents in 2012, in what the U.S. Department of Justice described as the largest healthcare fraud settlement in U.S. history. GSK paid $3 billion fine to resolve its liability over the fraud allegations and failure to report safety data. So he just shows that you can't trust the scientific data anymore because it's so heavily influenced by the drug industry. And if you don't believe me, well, there's drug after drug that'll show you. Number 3 on this list. Rising carbon dioxide levels threaten to permanently disrupt vital ocean bacteria. Imagine a car heading toward a cliff's edge and its gas pedal stuck on the floor. That's what Robert Perkins wrote is a metaphor for what climate change will do to the key group of ocean bacteria known as Trichodesmimium. I know that's awful pronunciation. According to a study published in the 2015 issue of Nature Communications by researchers at the University of Southern California and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Trichodesmimium is found in nutrient-poor parts of the ocean, where it converts nitrogen gas into material that can be used to form other life. From algae to whales, all life needs nitrogen to grow. Reporting for The Guardian, Emma Howard quoted Eric Webb, one of the study's researchers, who explained how the process of nitrogen fixation makes trichodesmimium the fertilizing agent of the open ocean. And so this is the reduced levels in this, and because of CO2 increase in climate change, it's starting to die off. So that's number 3, which is great. All those climate deniers, we can just keep denying climate and we'll just all die because we need to make money. Number 4, search engine algorithms and electronic voting machines could swing 2016 election. Now this is ironic, isn't it? From search engines, algorithms, to electronic voting machines, technology provides opportunities for manipulation of voters and their votes in ways that could profoundly affect the results in the 2016 elections. In the United States, the 2012 presidential election was won by a margin of just 3.9%, and historically, half of U.S. presidential elections have been won by margins of under 7%. These narrow but consequential victory margins underscore the importance of understanding how secret proprietary technologies, whether they are newly developing or increasingly outdated, potentially swing election results. Mark Frary in Index of Censorship describes the latest research by Robert Epstein and Ronald Robertson of the American Institute of Behavioral Research and Technology on what they call the search engine manipulation effect, or SEME. Their research focuses on the powerful role played by the secret algorithms, including Google's PageRank and Facebook's EdgeRank, that determine the content of our internet searches and the results of the social media network feeds. Epstein and Roberts studied over 4,500 undecided voters in the U.S. and India using randomized, controlled, double-blind methods, which result subjects who matched as closely as possible each country's electorate. The results, Frary reported, were shocking. Epstein and Robertson showed that the biased search rankings could shift the voting preferences of undecided voters by 20% or more. So this goes into how the search engines can be manipulated on Google, Facebook, etc. to swing it by 20% or more. And this also plays into the new fake news thing. You start getting more and more fake news about things. It starts building up more people searching for that thing. That particular subject can swing the vote as well, up to 20%. Number 5 on the most unreported stories, the Project Censored list. Corporate exploitation of global refugee crisis masked as humanitarianism. According to a June 2015 United Nations report, 60 million people worldwide are now refugees due to conflicts in their home nations. 60 million. The United Nations report indicated that during 2014, 1 out of every 122 people was a refugee. God. Internally displaced or an asylum seeker, and over half of these refugees were children. For previous Project Censored coverage of the global refugee crisis, see Global Forced Displacement Top 50 Million. Project Censored story of number 14 in 2016. While Syrian refugees account for the largest number, an estimated 11 million, other places such as Colombia, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, have large refugee populations that remain largely unreported. According to Antonio Guterres, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, at the time of the report, we are witnessing a paradigm change, an unchecked slide into an era in which the scale of global forced displacement, as well as the response required, is now clearly dwarfing anything seen before. Although the extent of the global refugee crisis has been covered in the corporate media, including, for example, the New York Times and Washington Post, the exploitation of refugees has been less well covered. The report on Alternet that warned of the World Bank private enterprise solution to the Syrian displacement crisis. Under the guise of humanitarian aid, this writer wrote, the World Bank is enticing Western companies to launch new investments in Jordan in order to profit from the labor of stranded Syrian refugees. In a country where migrant workers have faced forced servitude, torture, and wage theft, there is a reason to be concerned that this capital-intensive solution to the mounting crisis of displacement will establish sweatshops that specifically target war refugees for hyper-exploitation. According to a World Bank press release by its president, Jim Young Kim, we are exploring the creation of special economic zones and encouraging investment in municipal projects and labor-intensive work. Jesus Christ. So basically, the World Bank will go in and use these refugees as cheap labor. God, man, does this capitalism, huh? Isn't it great? Number 6 of the most unreported Project Censored stories. Over 1.5 million American families live on under $2 a day per person per day. According to Catherine Eden of the and Luke Schaefer, sociologists and authors of the book $2 per Day, Living on Almost Nothing in America, in 2011, more than 1.5 million U.S. families, including 3 million children, lived on as little as $2 per person per day on any given month. I mean, that one writes itself. In America, the richest country in the world, over 1.5 million American families, not people, families. 3 million children living on $2 a day in America. That's in America. And the secretary, the guy that was just nominated for the labor secretary, is anti. He doesn't want there to be anti that $15 an hour, anti-union. I mean, it's just horrible. Number 7, no end in sight for Fukushima disaster. 5 years after the 9.0 earthquake and tsunami that destroyed the nuclear power plant at Fukushima, Dar Jamal reported that Tokyo Electric Power Company, TEPCO, officials in charge of the plant continue to release large quantities of radioactive waste into the Pacific Ocean. Arnold Gunderson, a former nuclear industry senior vice president, called Fukushima the biggest industry catastrophe in the history of humankind. As Jamal reported, experts such as Gunderson continue warning officials of the public that the problem is not going away. As Gunderson told Jamal, with 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, and now with Fukushima, you can pinpoint the exact day and time they started, but they never end. And he's right. Fukushima is still a fucking disaster, and it's getting worse, and there's no end in sight. Number 8. Syria's war spurred by contest for gas delivery to Europe, not Muslim sectarianism. This is a great story. I mean, this is sad, but it's great. Kind of gives you what's really going on in Syria. At least 4 years into the crisis in Syria, most people have no idea how this war even got started. Munar Muwasa said, reported for Mini Press News in September 2015. So he goes into how it happened. In 2011 to 2012, after Syrian President Bashir al-Assad refused to cooperate with Turkey's proposal to create a natural gas pipeline between Qatar and Turkey through Syria, Turkey and its allies became the major architect of Syria's civil war. The proposed pipeline would have bypassed Russia to reach European markets currently dominated by Russian gas giant Gazprom. As a result, Muhawash wrote, the Middle East is being torn to shreds by manipulative plans to gain oil and gas access by pitting people against one another based on religion. Sound familiar? The ensuing chaos provides ample cover to install a new regime that's more amenable to opening up oil pipelines and ensuring favorable routes for the highest bidders. In 2012, the U.S., UK, France, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, along with Turkey, began to organize, arm, and finance rebels to form the Free Syrian Army. Consistent with long-standing U.S. plans to destabilize Syria, these nations formed a pact, the Group of Friends of the Syrian People, that implemented a sectarian divide-and-conquer strategy to overthrow President Assad. It's important to note the timing. Muhawash wrote, the coalition and meddling in Syria came about immediately on the heels of discussions of an Iran-Iraq-Syria gas pipeline that was to be built between 2014 and 2016 from Iran's giant South Pars field through Iraq and Syria, with a possible extension to Lebanon. It would eventually reach Europe, the target export market, as Mint Press News reported. Access to oil and gas, not sectarian differences, is the underlying cause in the violent conflict and humanitarian disaster in Syria. The war is being sold to the public as a Sunni Shiite conflict by the Friends of Syria because it's the public understood economic interest at stake. Most people would not support any covert funding or arming of rebels or direct intervention. Based on secret U.S. cables revealed by WikiLeaks, Muhawash reported that foreign meddling in Syria began several years before the Syrian revolt erupted. U.S. State Department cables from 2006 documented plans to incite civil strife that would lead to the overthrow of Assad's government. The leaks revealed the United States partnering with nations including Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, and Egypt to fuel Sunni Shiite sectarianism to divide Syria. Although there is plenty of coverage in U.S. corporate media about the violence in Syria and the refugee crisis that is sweeping Europe and reaching North America, this coverage has failed to address the economic interests, including control of potentially lucrative gas pipelines. The motive the U.S. and its allies, U.S. corporate news coverage of the Ukraine crisis, was comparable in that it too downplayed the geopolitical oil interest as a source of tension among Russia, the U.S., and their respective allies, as Nafiz Ahmad has reported. See U.S. media hypocrisy in covering covering Ukraine crisis. That's so true. Instead, corporate news coverage has characterized the conflict in Syria as a battle for democracy that has been hijacked by Sunni and Shiite interests. For example, Oren Durrell of USA Today identified a mind-boggling and dangerous slew of shifting and competing alliances involved in the Syrian conflict, including groups categorized as pro-government, anti-government, anti-Islamic State, and other fighters. But he did not address the gas interests that according to Muhawash, reportedly ultimately underpin the conflict. Instead, much of what passes for news coverage for the corporate press adheres to a pattern that Muhawash identified and critiqued as simplistic and Orientalist, framing conflict in the Middle East and specifically Syria as sectarian in order to paint the region as people as barbaric. Wow, wow. Number 9, Big Pharma, political lobbying not limited to presidential campaigns. Pharmaceutical companies have been among the biggest political spenders for years, according to data from the Center for Responsive Politics. As Mike Ludwig of Truthout reported, based on CRP data, large pharmaceutical companies made over 51 million in campaign donations during the 2012 presidential election, nearly 32 million in the 2014 elections, and as September 2015, they had already put 10 million in the 2016 elections. During the 2014 election, Pfizer led drug companies with 1.5 million in federal campaign donations, followed by Amgen with 1.3 million and McKesson with 1.1 million. Although these are large sums of money, campaign donations by large pharmaceutical companies pale in comparison to how much they spent on lobbying politicians and influencing policies outside of elections. As Ludwig reported, according to data gathered on 2014 elections, the industry spent $7 on lobbying for every dollar spent on the election. Jesus Christ. So you think you hear, like, this is a great story. The reason I wanted to report this story was because you always hear, oh, well, they only gave $100,000 or $1 million to their campaign, and that's a lot of money, but it's not, out of $1 billion or out of $300 million or whatever Donald Trump raised, Hillary Clinton raised over $1 billion. It's not that much, but really the money gets more donated in the lobbying. $7 they spent lobbying compared to every dollar they spent donating money to a campaign. That's an incredible story. That's an incredible story. That's where the money is. Okay, and the last one for this video, we're going to just do 1 through 10. Number 10, CISA, the Internet Surveillance Act no one is discussing. On December 18th, 2015, President Obama signed the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act, CISA, C-I-S-A, into law as part of a 2,000-page omnibus spending bill. As drafted, CISA was intended to improve cybersecurity in the United States through enhanced sharing of information about cybersecurity threats and for other purposes. The act authorized the creation of a system for corporate informants to provide customers' data to the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, which in turn would share this information with other federal agencies, including the Department of Commerce, Defense, which includes the NSA, Energy, Justice, which includes the FBI, the Treasury, which oversees the IRS, and the Office of the Director of the National Intelligence. As Sam Thielman of The Guardian reported, civil liberties experts have been dismayed when Congress used the omnibus spending bill to advance some of the legislation's most invasive components. Anthony Romero of the American Civil Liberties Union criticized Congress for using the spending bill to pursue their extremist agendas, sneaking damaging and discriminatory riders into a must-pass bill usurps the democratic process, he told the Guardian Lauren Weinstein, who co-founded People for Internet Responsibility, also spoke critically of the legislation. There is not a culture of security and privacy established in the government yet. You have to have that before you even consider sharing the amount of data CISA would cover. Evan Greer of the Fight for the Future called CISA a disingenuous attempt to quietly expand the U.S. government surveillance program. In 2015, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell had attempted to attach the bill as an amendment to the annual National Defense Authorization Act, but the Senate blocked this by a vote of 56-40. Jesus. As Andy Greenberg reported for Wired, the final Senate version of the bill removed personal information protections that privacy advocates had fought successfully to have included in the previous version. Greenberg reported that CISA had alarmed the privacy community by providing a loophole in privacy laws that would enable intelligence and law enforcement officials to engage in surveillance without warrants. God damn. The version of CISA approved in the Senate by a vote of 74-21 in October 2015, Greenberg reported, creates the ability for the president to set up portals for agencies like the FBI and offices of the Director of National Intelligence, so the companies hand information directly to law enforcement and intelligence agencies instead of the Department of Homeland Security. Commenting on this aspect of the legislation, Jadzir Butler and Greg Nojam of the Center of Democracy and Technology wrote, information shared for cybersecurity reasons should be used for cybersecurity purposes, but this legislation does not impose this simple requirement. Greenberg's Wired article also noted that tech firms, including Apple, Twitter, and Reddit, as well as 55 civil liberties groups, had opposed the bill, and that in July 2015, the DHS itself warned the bill would sweep away privacy protections while inundating the agency with data of dubious value. So basically they're saying they want to collect more money, they want to collect more information and more data, they want to spy on you, they want to know what you're doing all the time. And a lot of these private companies don't like it, don't want it, Twitter doesn't want to do it, Apple doesn't want to give up the data because their users don't want to use that. Their users don't want their data and their information to be given to the government. They just don't. And by the way, if you think it's only just about the government and spying on you, this data will then be used for private companies as well. Well, what are the trends? That'll be used for companies who look for trends in stock market trends, for people who are just straight marketing to you. It will be your information will be used for some other reason. I mean, we're already seeing. There was a story written that in fact AT&T is being paid by the government to give them data. So all the data that AT&T collects that they give to the government anyway, they're getting paid by your tax dollars to give them data. And by the way, there's so much of this data, it's almost useless. There's so much of it that it's almost impossible to do anything with. I mean, it really is. It's just a massive amount of data. And they put it in a hard drive, they put it in a mainframe, and then they data mine it eventually and go try to find whatever information they can find using keywords and using certain names and things like that. So, all right, so that's 1 through 10. I will finish on the next video. I will do 11 through 22.